J.K. Rowling has become a beacon of sanity in an otherwise absurd and insane world of trans zealotry. Scotland's government, you see, has both lost their mind when it comes to the subject of gender and sex, and has also succumbed to the temptation of censoring speech with their new hate speech laws. It's yet another gigantic stride towards dystopian tyranny and a further darkening of the once bright and hopeful free world. Now, Scotland has joined the long list of tyrannical regimes of the past and have now created a new act, which they are calling the Hate Crime and Public Order Act of 2021. And the aim and purpose of this is to consolidate all the existing hate crime legislation in Scotland and introduce new offenses of stirring up hatred against protected groups, which includes age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and variations in sex characteristics. And now, stirring up racial hatred was already prohibited under a law dating all the way back to 1986. But this new act specifies that for behavior to be considered criminal under this legislation, it must be both threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. This legislation also includes so-called free speech protections, somehow allowing for the ridicule or insult of a religion, for example, as long as it does not meet the threshold of criminality defined by this act. Which, basically, just to translate this for you, you can make fun of Christians. That's not a problem. But if you do the same to Islam, they will come for you. No, the real purpose behind such a law like this is to further tighten the noose around speech that the government wants to stop, as well as forcing people to go along with the absurd and silly lie of gender ideology. You see, if you can force the public to go along with this big lie, if you can make them agree with what they know in their heart to be clearly wrong, like the idea that a woman is a feeling that anyone can have or be instead of the clear, immutable biology that makes us the gender, the sex that we are, then you have essentially trapped an entire culture in a prison of the mind. This abhorrent act that Scotland has put into law here has been rightly criticized for its clear and present danger as a tool to criminalize speech that the government does not like. They are using this excuse of offensive as a means and a reason to lock away anyone who would dare think for themselves. And so here we are. J.K. Rowling, who otherwise has been an ally to the progressives, an ally to the far left, has drawn the ire of those who demand total obedience to their ideology of woke, all because she dared to be vocal of her defense of women. I'm going to read a piece from this article here. This is NDTV World. The article goes on to say that J.K. Rowling will not face an investigation over her comments about a controversial new law in Scotland aimed at cutting hate speech, including against trans people. This, according to police of Scotland. The Harry Potter author and opponent of the gender identity movement criticized the Hate Crime and Public Order Act, which came into force Monday, calling it an attack on free speech, which, of course, it is. Now, the police of Scotland said that they received complaints about J.K. Rowling's post, but a spokesperson added that comments are not assessed to be criminal and no further action will be taken. Yeah, because they know that there's going to be a giant excrement storm if they do arrest her. Which kind of brings me back to the madness of this debate over biological sex and gender identity. So let's talk about that. The controversy surrounding Rowling touches on the broader debate about the nature of what is biological sex and what is gender identity. Critics of Rowling's stance argue that her views are overly simplistic and fail to recognize the complexity of gender, or I should say, or rather the new corrupted definition of gender. It's simply a new way to corrupt language by changing its meaning to encompass a range of identities beyond the binary male and female categories. The people that criticize Rowling and that are pushing for this are emphasizing the importance of respecting individuals' self-identified genders, arguing in bad faith that policies allowing transgender individuals to self-identify do not pose a threat to women's safety, even though anyone with half a brain on their shoulders know that this cannot possibly be true. Now, Rowling's comments obviously led to a significant criticism from those who demand ideological purity. Even though for the most part, she agrees with everything that people on the progressive left, she's always been on board, except for this one little thing. So they, of course, started calling her transphobic. And this included calls for boycotts of the Harry Potter franchise. There was criticism against her from actors within her own Harry Potter film series. You had Daniel Radcliffe, Rupert Grint, Emma Watson, And of course, there were the public protests against her. But much to the enragement of the people that wanted her gone, her success has been continuing undaunted. This includes her Harry Potter video game, Hogwarts Legacy, which sold over 22 million copies, paving the way for a TV reboot of her book series. She has remained undeterred from her stance against the erasure of women. And indeed, the debate over whether the biological sex can be changed is a contentious one. The core of the argument against the idea that biological sex can be changed is rooted in genetics and biology. So, biological sex is determined by the chromosomes that are present in an individual's cells. Typically, you've got XX chromosomes, which lead to female characteristics, and XY chromosomes, which lead to male characteristics. This chromosomal makeup is established at conception and is present in every cell of the body. This makes it immutable from a genetic standpoint. Now, the argument that biological sex is immutable is supported and confirmed, by the way, by the fact that, despite medical interventions such as hormonal therapy and sex reassignment surgery, the underlying genetic and chromosomal characteristics of an individual do not and cannot be changed. Therefore, when you have a transgender woman who has undergone sex reassignment surgery, they're still going to have the XY chromosomes if they were born with them. And thus, from a genetic perspective, the transgender woman still remains genetically male. You cannot undo this. No matter how much people might applaud for brave and stunning and all that, you simply cannot change this. So let's talk then about the medical perspectives on sex and gender. How in the world did we even get here? Medical and scientific literature distinguishes between sex and gender these days. This is true. Sex is typically used to refer to the biological differences between males and females, such as reproductive organs, chromosomes, and secondary sexual characteristics. Gender, on the other hand, while it used to apply to sex as well, was corrupted, and we can trace this all the way back to the early 1960s, which is where we can find the earliest terms of gender identity and gender role. And by 1980, Gender Identity Disorder of Childhood was included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 3rd edition. Now, this distinction was used by the radical feminists of the 1960s and 70s who sought to differentiate the biological and social dimensions of sex and gender. And what I can only conclude to be one of the main driving factors of this was the desire to break traditional roles in the name of girl power. They didn't like the fact that there were roles that people were associating with their sex. And, you could argue there's nothing wrong with that. Just because we've operated a society a certain way doesn't mean it has to always be that way, right? So, no problem there. However, in their zeal to break away, these feminists' zeal to break away from the idea that roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that society considers appropriate for men and women, and their desire to get away from these, led to change in our society right around the time of the 1980s. So this is when you have the popularity of the term gender, and it really kind of exploded here, which led us inexorably to the day where we can no longer even define what a woman is, which is insane. So that then is going to bring me to what I like to call the religious fervor of the gender ideology. And it's such a religious fervor to such an extent that its believers are so committed to their ideas and their ideologies that they disregard biological realities. The very fact that we're even having this conversation is incredibly insane. Those who argue in favor of this transhuman movement are completely and utterly disconnected from the scientific understanding of what sex is. It is binary. It is chromosomally determined characteristics that we cannot change. But their faith has blinded them to the cold, hard reality of life as a human being. What we are programmed with at birth, it's at the very core of what we are, and no one and nothing at this point in time can change this fact. We cannot change our chromosomes. Now, maybe someday we'll get there. Maybe someday this will be a reality that you can actually change your gender. But I highly doubt it. Nevertheless, this religious zealotry of movement is moving on full steam. They don't care. Which brings me back to this latest debate on free speech versus this hate speech. The controversy surrounding the Hate Crime and Public Order of Scotland Act here reflects a broader fight over the diminishing freedoms that the people of Scotland are enduring. it is a fate, by the way, that much of the Western world is now facing as well. The allies of destroying free speech hide behind the excuse that the balance between protecting individuals from hate speech and ensuring the right to freedom of expression is paramount. It is the same evil infection that has come here to the States, all under the guise of inclusivity and so-called caring about people's feelings. It is a tool which has been used to wipe away people's ability to think and speak freely. And you can see this with cancel culture, which the radical left, the radical progressives, the woke, and the DEI types have used to wage a war of destruction against freedom of speech and expression. And I might add, with great success. We've fallen so far as a culture here in the US in just over a decade. We used to be a proud bastion of freedom in the modern world. But that time has been clouded with the sickness of those who push hate speech logic. It's an insidious tool that has been used to slyly push people into accepting chains under the guise of self-moderation. It is the thought police. And social media has been one of the greatest and latest tools that has been used here to cull, at least here in American culture, the ability to think freely. And they do this one topic at a time. And by the way, we can trace the roots of so-called hate speech to hate crime laws here in America. Hate crime laws was a tool used to add extra punishments to already grievous crimes. So for example, if you murdered someone, that's bad. But if you murdered them and also had some hate in your heart, maybe towards their race or their gender, that was the real problem. Not the killing of the person. No, that was bad, but not as bad as the thought. And this, of course, was stupid and absurd. It was preposterous. And yet, over the years, this settled into the norms of society, to the point where no one even bats an eye when we talk about hate crimes. I don't think people really realize that the groundwork here was laid to eventually come for the way you speak and think, which is, of course, where we are today. So, when it comes to Scotland and, frankly, the UK, the citizens of both Scotland and the UK should be pushing for, demanding even, a Bill of Rights that protects them from this growing darkness. Outside of the US, most free societies don't actually have a Bill of Rights that enshrines free speech. We were an anomaly, which is part of the problem of what's happening now, where social media has now collaborated together to eliminate speech. And when you have large corporations that are working directly with governments, which is essentially corporate fascism, you've laid the groundwork for tyranny. You must have robust free speech protections. You must strengthen protections for the freedom of expression in your laws to ensure that insane hate speech legislation cannot unduly infringe on your fundamental right to think and speak the way you want to. Frankly, without this core tenet, all free societies are just a clock, endlessly ticking down to its expiration, to the day when those who rule finally say, okay, time to strip all your freedoms away. And it'll happen slowly, but inexorably. So for those of you who will hear this, I would only ask, are you really listening to this? People of the West, do you hear me? If there was ever a time to defend your freedom, now would be the time.